Long ago, when the world was young, a terrible war blew up in Egypt. A war between Setech, the Red Lord of the Desert, and Heru, his nephew, whose father, Azur, the green-skinned pharaoh, he had murdered and displaced. All through his life, Heru had been raised by his mother, Azet, to seek vengeance upon his uncle, to restore the throne to the direct descendants himself as the son of Azur. And decade after decade after decade, this terrible war raged on and on and on. And it reached such a point of desperation that Setech, who was renowned for his ruthlessness, determined to do whatever it took to break the lineage of his brother's son. No matter how debased, no matter how vile by the standards of the 21st century, he would do it. And so one day, having imbibed far too much of his favourite ale, he stormed drunk into the desert, seeking out his nephew. Mile after mile after mile he went, taking his ale sacks with him so he could swig as he went, until at length he came upon a light in the distance, the light around which Heru and his assistants, his servants, were camped. And staggering drunken into the camp, he found them asleep, and he set upon his nephew, assaulting him, violating him in a way that does not bear thinking about. And it was only by Heru's own quick thinking that the violation, while odious, was not as intrusive as it could have been. In that, and plug your ears if you're of a sensitive disposition, Heru, in the dark, put his hands together to form a tunnel. And when his taller, bigger, stronger uncle set upon him and thrust himself into what he thought was one part of his nephew, it turned out to be another. And the job done, Setech staggered back off into the desert, for it was the law of Egypt in that day that anyone so ill-used, male or female, could not sit upon the throne, could not claim lineage. And so Setech thought that he had sufficiently violated his nephew as to destroy any claim he could ever make upon the throne without needing to actually murder him. And Heru, horrified, traumatized by what had happened, by daylight staggered out to find his mother, to find Azet, and explain to her the dreadful, terrible, vile things that had happened in the night. And Azet looked at her son and looked him up and down and saw there was no blood where she expected to see blood, and asked him quite what had happened, and he explained what he had done, and she looked upon his hands that were still unwashed. and at once she snatched a sword from one of the guards in the palace where she dwelt, and severed her son's two hands, and they fell to the floor. Now, of course, had she done that to any mere mortal, the blood would have been spouting up to the ceiling, and they'd quite possibly have bled to death. But her son, of course, was divine, and could survive such things. And when he asked, "Mother, why have you chopped off my hand?" she said, the corruption that Setech has done to you will spread and spread like gangrene up your arms towards your heart. And it is better to lose your hands now than have your heart corrupted. The pollution of Setech will eat into your your very spiritual centre. And she cast the two stained hands into the waters of the River Nile, that they should sink down and down and down to the bed, believing, quite sensibly, that had she merely left them upon the floor, then her son would have somehow, with his stumps, gathered them up and gone to seek medical aid to have them reattached. But at the bottom of the Nile bed, well, they were as good as lost forever. And off she went to read through her books of magic and spellcraft to see if she could find a spell that would conjure up two brand new, unpolluted, unstained hands to attach to her son's stumps. But while she was off reading, Setech wandered, handless, bereft, in a state of shock, having been violated first one way and then mutilated another, and he came upon Ra, the king of the gods, the great falcon-headed king. And he showed the stumps to Ra and told the tale of Setech, and Ra was mortified and said, "Something must be done. What is it, my child, that you want?" And Heru, unaware that his mother was looking for spells to regrow brand new hands, said, I want my hands back. And so Ra sent for Sebek, the lord of the Nile, and Sebek came, his great crocodile tail swishing the sands of the desert, his great jaws snapping as he approached. And he listened to the tale of Ra, and he saw the stumps where Heru's beautiful hands had been. And he said, his great jaws clapping, that he would go into the depths of the Nile, and he would swim and swim and swim and find the severed hands and bring them up. And this he did. He dived with a great splash into the Nile and swam the length of the river, looking and looking and looking, hour upon hour upon hour. He searched through the weeds and the mud and the silt at the bottom of the riverbed, and all of his crocodile children came and joined in with the search, for 1,000 eyes are better than 2. And the people who lived upon the banks of the Nile quaked in terror to see the waters of the Nile churning and churning, as seemingly hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of crocodiles came from far and wide and at once filled the river, churning the waters up. And at length Sebek himself spotted the 2 severed hands in the mud at the bottom of the river, and he dived down, and he tried to pick them up with his limbs, but you must appreciate that Sebek is rather an unusual shape, with a great crocodile head and a great crocodile tail, but the body, the torso, the arms and legs, like that of a human. And it is not easy for him to manipulate things with his hands and see what he's doing because of the shape of his head. So he tried to pick up the hands, and he succeeded, and he got as far as the bank, and he tried to put them onto the bank of the Nile, but they were so slippery with the divine blood leaking out of them and the silt and the mud upon them that they kept falling back into the water. Every time he managed to get them again and put them on the bank, they fell back into the water again. Perhaps it was the blood, perhaps it was the slipperiness of the silt, perhaps it was Azet's magic ensuring that those hands stayed where she had cast them, into the bed of the river Nile. But at length Sebek would not be frustrated. He sat, sunning himself, as crocodiles do, upon the banks of the Nile, and came up with a plan. He snatched up a clump of reeds and broke them with his mighty teeth. And there he began to weave and twist and turn them into a shape that became essentially the very first fish trap, a bit like a lobster basket. He wove this creation, and he took it to the bottom of the river, and there he scraped it along this wickerwork, reedwork basket, scraped it along the silt until he caught up the 2 hands inside the basket, and he swam back up to the banks, and the water, of course, washed all of the mud and the silt out of this fish trap basket, and he placed it with the hands still inside, unable to escape back into the watery depths, upon the banks of the Nile. And throwing back his great head, he opened his mighty jaws and called to Heru, this great croaking dinosaur-like roar. For Sebek is ancient enough to remember when his kith and kin, the great reptile giants, strode the earth and ruled all. He has a long, long memory. Heru, hearing the summons, came and saw his 2 hands in the fish trap. He plucked them up and, well, with his stumps, and rushed back to Ra, thanking Sebek and his many crocodile children for all of their efforts in searching through the waters. And he presented Heru this fish trap with a hand still in it, to Ra. And Ra found himself in a challenging position. For he knew the wishes of Heru to have the hands reattached to him, but he also knew the wishes of Heru's mother, Azet, that the hands, with their stain of Setek's wicked deed, should remain forever separate from her son. And how was he to resolve the demands of two conflicting deities? If he pleased one, he would offend the other, and vice versa. And looking at these hands, he noticed that they were not just laying there in the reed basket, they were moving with a life of their own. And he looked at them more closely, and he said at length to Heru, "These hands have acquired life of their own. These are as your sons. They are beings in their own right now, separate from you, though they came from you. And like normally sired children, they are part of you, part of your blood." Well, Heru did not know what to do. He could hardly have his two sons stitched back onto his stumps, denying them life when they became part of the whole again. And he said to Heru, What am I to do? What am I to do? And he said to Ra, "What am I to do?" And Ra sat and thought and thought. And at length he called to Sebek, and Sebek came forth, and Ra explained to Sebek what had happened, that these hands had acquired a life of their own. And Sebek said, "Well, that then clearly explains why they kept slipping back and back and back into the waters. They are beings in their own right who did not want to be taken from their watery realms. What are we to do?" And Sebek said, "Lay them upon the earth. Take them from the basket, lay them upon the earth. Let them go where they will and follow. And there a solution will come." And they did exactly that. Ra opened the basket, the fish trap, and the hands skittered with a life of their own. But like two twins, they never strayed far from each other. They skittered in the same directions. And Heru and Ra and Sebek followed in the wake as these two strange hand beings ran across the desert, mile after mile after mile across the desert, until at immense length they came to the city of Nekhen in Upper Egypt. And there the two hands walked, if you can call it that, into a temple that had only just been built, but had not yet been blessed, not yet been properly consecrated. And they crawled into the very heart of that temple, into the central building around which everything else is constructed, into the Mamasi. And in the Holy of Holies, they crawled up and set themselves upon the altar where the statue of whichever god that this temple had been built for would go. And Heru asked, "To whom is this temple dedicated?" And one of the priests who would be destined to serve in that temple once the consecration was completed rushed out of the darkness, bowing low before the three gods, and said, "Mighty Heru, mighty Ra, mighty Sebek, this temple, once it is blessed and once it is consecrated, will be blessed in honour of you, Heru." And so Heru decided, with the guidance of Ra and the guidance of Sebek, that his two children, his two hands, with the life of their own, should dwell as sacred objects within this temple. And they became relics in the temple of Heru. And offerings were made to them and to their father from that day forth. And in recognition of the great service done to him by Sebek in retrieving the hands, and of course to humanity in his invention of the fish trap, which greatly improved the diet of mere mortals for thousands of years to come. A zoo was established in Nekhen, the first zoo in the world. Wild beasts from far and wide were brought to live in the zoo so that people who had never seen these wild beasts could come and get close to them and see them. And two of the first inhabitants of this great zoo were two of the children of Sebech, two of the crocodiles who had helped churn the waters of the Nile in search of the missing hands, were brought to live and be fed and nurtured and looked after and pampered as befits the divine crocodile's children. From that day until the ends of their life, and when they died, further crocodiles were brought, and they continued to honour the spirit of Sebek as well as the other wild animals that dwelt within the city of the falcon, as Nekhen was often called. And in due course, should you be wondering, as Zet finished reading through her spell scrolls and papyri, her books of wisdom and magic, and found the very spell that she knew was there somewhere, and so she was able to grow new hands upon the stumps of her son. And so in some respects, Heru could be said to have 4 hands, the 2 attached to the end of his arms, and the 2 animated hands that live within the temple of Nekhen. Thank you.